Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to the second webinar of this two-part webinar series hosted jointly by the GBV Area of Responsibility Community of Practice, as well as the Child Protection Gender-Based Violence Community of Practice, which is under the Interagency Child and Adolescent Survivors Initiative, or CASI, as many of you may have heard about. Just as a quick note, this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared following the session along with any of the tools and resources and materials that are discussed or talked about or shared during this next hour and a half. My name is Jennifer Lee. I facilitate the Child Protection Gender-Based Violence Community of Practice. And we're a community of, I think now over 250 child protection and gender-based violence practitioners from various disciplines across over 50 countries. And we meet on a monthly basis to exchange and learn from one another around issues related to child and adolescent survivors of sexual violence in humanitarian settings, but have also spanned into sort of more development settings as well. As I mentioned earlier, this is being co-hosted by the GBV AOR Community of Practice. So I wanted to pass over to my colleague, Sarah Martin, who's a co-moderator of that Community of Practice, just to say a few words on the GBV AOR COP. Sarah?
Hi, everyone. This is Sarah. I'm the coordinator of the Community of Practice along with my colleague, Beth Mann. It's a bit early in the morning for her. She's based in California in the USA, and I'm in Europe. So we are a community of almost 800 members at this moment of gender-based violence specialists from around the world working on gender-based violence and humanitarian emergencies. And anyone who has an interest in gender-based violence, getting more information about it is welcome to join us. And there's some information there on the page for you. And again, at the end of the presentation, we'll put it back up. And this webinar actually was the brainchild of one of our members who wrote to us and said, I see a gap in looking at children and adolescents who are GBV survivors, those that have disabilities. So could you guys help us out with that? So Jennifer and I leapt upon this opportunity and identified these amazing speakers you're going to hear from today. But that just is a reminder that if there is a gap of information that you want more about, you can always write to us at gbvcop@gmail.com and we'll do what we can. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sarah. So before we get started, similar to the last webinar last week, we'd like to sort of warm up by doing another poll. Just to kind of get us all ready for the discussion and kind of see where we are at in terms of our sort of attitudes, beliefs, thinking around children and adolescents with disabilities. So you should see the first question launching on your screen. And it says, child and adolescent survivors with disabilities are not able to disclose when they have been sexually abused. And this is completely anonymous, so feel free to answer whatever you think based on your experience, based on your expertise, and then I'll close the poll when I see that a majority has responded. So again, the first statement is child and adolescent survivors with disabilities are not able to disclose when they have been sexually abused. So it's actually a kind of good spread right now. I'll show the results once the majority have completed. But again, completely anonymous, so feel free to really respond in however you're thinking or your thoughts around this statement. And thanks to those of you who have been introducing yourselves. Nice to see you all here. Okay. So it looks like things have slowed down. We have nearly 90% have voted. So I'll keep it up for another 10 seconds and then I'll close the poll. Last chance. Okay. So it looks like, all right, I'm going to close the poll. So if you see on your screen, it says most of you disagree. 44% of you disagree with the statement that child and adolescent survivors with disabilities are not able to disclose. And then 32% of you actually agreed. and then strongly disagree was 16%, and 14% was strongly agree. So actually some variance. And so we're going to talk about that today with our guest speakers, facilitators, especially because I think in our work with case management, which is the focus of today's session, this is a huge issue, right? And so I'm going to table the actual discussion, but if you have any thoughts around this, or if you want to further explain why you responded in the way that you did, please feel free to put that in the chat, but also keep this in mind and keep these sort of what you responded with and how others responded in mind as we move into the discussion. I'm going to launch the next question. So let's see. Continue. Sorry, not that one. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, here we go. So number 2, children and adolescents with disabilities cannot make their own decisions. So second statement is children and adolescents with disabilities cannot make their own decisions. Strongly agree, agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. This one seems a little bit more weird since I have access to all the information. But again, it's anonymous, so don't worry, I don't know who's responding to what. And as people are responding, welcome to Shifat from Bangladesh and Linda from Syria. Hi, Alexina. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll in another 10 seconds. Last chance for anyone else to respond to the statement, children and adolescents with disabilities cannot make their own decisions. All right, I'm going to end the polling and share the results. So most of you strongly disagreed with this statement, 56% of you, and then slightly lower, 35% disagreed, 9% agreed, and 6% strongly agreed. Okay, great. Somebody is raised, Haifa is raising your hand. Haifa, did you have a question or do you want to write it in the chat? We just have 2 more polling.
Sorry,
yeah, go ahead, Haifa.
I'm so sorry, but by mistake, I raised my hand. I'm so sorry.
No worries, Haifa.
I'm so sorry.
It's nice to hear your voice and welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for everyone. I'm so sorry again.
No worries, no worries. We like the participation, even if it's by mistake. So, okay.
Thank you.
So, yeah, you're welcome. The third statement is children and adolescents with disabilities are often neglected by their caregivers. Strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree. So the statement is children and adolescents are often neglected by their caregivers. Seems like you all are a little bit slower to respond to this one. So I think this is, yeah, it's an interesting one and really relevant, obviously, to this discussion today. I'll leave the poll open for another 10 seconds, but fewer of you have responded. Maybe you're thinking about it. Okay, so I'm gonna close the poll now. And so it looks like most people, 65%, agreed with the statement, children and adolescents with disabilities are often neglected by their caregivers. 26% of you disagreed, then strongly agreed with 7%, and 4% was strongly disagreed. And so again, we'll be talking about this because obviously involvement of caregivers in case management of children and adolescents generally is important, right? Or trusted caregivers, safe caregivers, but especially with children and adolescents with disabilities, I think that there's an added component there, and then sort of we'll talk about also adding the component of being a survivor of GBV. Last question, here we go. Okay, so this statement is, it is less important for a child or adolescent with a disability to have an education than a child or adolescent without a disability. Strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree. So it is less important for a child or adolescent with a disability to have an education than a child or adolescent without a disability. Okay, so this one seems like there might be a clear front runner, but I'll give it 15 more seconds. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll now. Thanks to those who participated. And it looks like most of you strongly disagreed, 78% of those who responded, followed by disagree, agree, and strongly agree. So all of these issues, I think, are hugely important in case management in general, right? Your ability to disclose, right, just to be able to receive the service, decision-making power, involvement of caregivers, particularly again for children and adolescents, and then obviously referral for services and your thinking around this. So a lot of these attitudes and beliefs will affect how we practice and how we support, right, in terms of our service delivery. So keep these in mind. I just want to, Brianna was just raising one question around the first question. She says that she agreed that girls with disabilities can have a very hard time disclosing GBV. For example, if responsive services cannot accommodate their needs. Additionally, if the abuse is from a caregiver or neighbor, that person may have control, definitely. So thanks for sharing and elaborating on that, Brianna. So I'm going to kind of move on from the polling now and really want to introduce our amazing guest speakers and facilitators who are much better equipped than I am to lead us all in this discussion and to sort of share their experience and learning. So we have Emma Pierce with us, who's a gender and inclusion consultant. And we also have Betsy Sherwood, who's a senior advisor for child protection at Child Fund International. And just as a bit of background, so Sarah Martin, who you all heard from a few minutes ago, was kind enough to introduce me to Emma, who was then kind enough to connect with Betsy as well. And I think this, after talking to a number of colleagues who work on inclusion and who work on inclusion of persons with disabilities, I think it's a bit of a niche area, right? This very specific focus on child and adolescent survivors with disabilities who are also survivors of GBV. And so we did our best to try to find the people with the most experience and expertise. We know that many of you also have a lot of experience as well and expertise, so we welcome you to also share and chime in, because this is really about learning from one another, but also recognizing that it is a niche area and there's not that many people who kind of have worked specifically on this very specific population or issue. So we're really lucky to have Emma and Betsy here to lead us in this discussion. But again, really want to hear from you all, especially those who are providing direct services, to hear about your challenges and learning and experiences. Just a quick note that as we go through this session, we have a lot to cover. So please feel free to write any questions or comments in the chat. Sarah has been kind enough to offer to monitor the chat, and we'll be taking note of all the questions, etc. And we will have time either during or at the end of the session to try to respond to those. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Emma and Betsy. And I think Emma is going to kick it off. So.
Yes, hi, thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Jennifer, and to everyone for participating in this webinar. I imagine many of you participated in last week's webinar as well, but I just wanted to give a quick reminder about the issue that we're facing when it comes to children and adolescents with disabilities and their experiences of violence. So some statistics that most people will be familiar with is that children with disabilities are 3 to 4 times more likely to experience all forms of violence than their non-disabled peers, and 3 times more likely to experience sexual violence than their non-disabled peers. And those are statistics from developed countries, from countries like Australia and the US. We don't have, obviously, these access to statistics from humanitarian context, but you can imagine how it might be considerably higher than this in humanitarian context. We do have some qualitative research that has been done in humanitarian contexts, which have shown that girls with disabilities and both girls and boys with intellectual disabilities are at risk of sexual violence in humanitarian contexts, and that the socioeconomic stress, breakdown of familial and community networks, and also exclusion, stigma and discrimination by family members and the community, but also service providers, adds to that risk of sexual violence. So risk mitigation as well as prevention are really critical. So I know we're going to spend most of today talking about case management, you know, supporting a survivor once they have presented to us for support. However, I just wanted to flag up that wherever possible, we do need to be including children and adolescents with disabilities in age and gender appropriate activities. Not only because it's going to reduce their risk, but also it's going to help us to identify those children that are at high risk and be able to support them appropriately. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So we did want to reshare a tool that we circulated last week again, because I think this tool is actually a really good simple tip sheet for how to foster inclusion in your programs, and it has some principles as well as some guidelines on how to do that. And this is for any type of programming, whether it be GBV, child protection programming, you know, your safe spaces, whatever activity you're running. The first thing we need to recognise is that children and adolescents with disabilities have a right to participate and be included in our programs. And so what that means, Elham talked a lot about that last week, but what that really means is that they have a right to be in that space, to be in our programs, and it's our job to address the barriers that are preventing them from accessing it. Another really good tip is to really look at the girl or the boy or the young person first, not necessarily their disability. We often hear from young people and children with disabilities how, you know, they might be accessing all kinds of services for their disability, but no one's invited them to the girls group because perhaps they're not recognised as a girl or as a boy or as, in some cases, as a mother and a wife, right? When we start to talk about adolescence and child marriage. The third really good principle to keep in mind is not to make assumptions when we first meet someone. We know that communication styles vary dramatically among children and adolescents, and the same applies to children and adolescents with disabilities. They have varying levels of skills and capacities, and you know, sometimes we make an assumption that someone doesn't understand us because they can't speak, or they may not be able to speak because, you know, perhaps they have another type of impairment, and sometimes we make that assumption just by looking at someone. So we do need to check our assumptions as we interact with children and adolescents with disabilities, because they're nearly always wrong. They do like to prove us wrong, children and adolescents with disabilities. The fourth principle that we're always talking about is this importance of identifying and valuing all contributions. Sometimes we make assumptions about the type of participation that we think young people should have in our programs. And we make an assumption that because a person with a disability or a child with a disability is quiet and sort of watching the program, perhaps sitting in the corner, that this is not a contribution to the group. But these contributions can be varying, and for someone who hasn't left their home in months, sitting in a group and just listening might be a massive change for them and a massive contribution to inclusion. So just make sure that we're always watching for those small changes that make a big difference in someone's life. And Betsy's going to talk a lot today about working with families and caregivers, because it was really interesting to see that point about the warm-up question about neglect. And one of the things that we've encountered a lot in our work in humanitarian contexts is that families of children with disabilities are often under extreme socioeconomic stress. We often find that they're living in extreme poverty. And sometimes we inadvertently label some of the coping strategies they're using as neglect, instead of looking at how do we remove some of the factors or the drivers that are leading to these negative coping strategies. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. Next slide, thanks. So we shared a couple of case studies with you, and we are going to spend some time in breakout groups talking through these case studies, but I did want to just sort of start, you know, start interacting with these case studies now, if that's okay. So we have two case studies. The first one is Sabine, who's a 13-year-old Syrian girl living in a refugee camp in Jordan. She has an intellectual disability. I'm not going to go through the whole case study because you should have read it prior, and also we will be talking about it in the breakout rooms. But the thing to be aware of with Sabine is that she likes to go out. She likes to wander around the camp. She's very, very active. Unfortunately, she came home one night and her mother noticed that something was wrong, that she wasn't quite right. And when she questioned her about what had happened, she said that some boys asked her to take off her underpants and then told her that they were going to play husband and wife with her. So it seems that she's disclosing a form of sexual assault. Then we have Amina, who is in Lebanon with her husband Ahmed and their baby. She's 16 years old, and she's actually acquired a new disability as a result of an injury she acquired when fleeing Syria. And she can no longer walk because of this injury. And her husband has been seeking assistance for her at the local women's centre. She does have family that live near her, but they have stopped coming to visit, and she thinks it's because they have to keep cleaning the house every time they come to visit. And she's also really, really worried about her daughter and you know, how the violence that they've experienced might be affecting her baby daughter. So these are two case studies that we wanted to spend some time on today, and I guess I wanted to pause for a moment and just ask you all, what considerations do you think might be important when we're when we're thinking about case management processes for Sabine and Amina? What are your first sort of thoughts or questions or concerns even? And you can either unmute yourself or you can write it in the chat box.
And just to note that Betsy has shared the first case study in the chat if you haven't had a chance to read it. And then she'll also be sharing a second. I was trying to, but I can't because I'm sharing my screen.
So can I just ask if anyone in the group has anything they'd like to share about their first instincts about the case management process for either Sabine or Amina?
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Chipo. I would like to pass a comment on the Sabina case study. For me, I think my first instinct is how do we mitigate what has happened and ensure that it does not repeat itself. Because this is an outgoing child, a child who likes being outdoors, who likes playing and interacting with people. So I'm not very comfortable with kind of restricting the movement of the child, but perhaps to think, how do we empower the child to better from a very dangerous situation once she finds herself in, that kind of information. Thank you.
Thank you, Chipo. I'm sorry you broke up a little bit during your statement there, but I caught that what you were saying is about how do we prevent it from happening again? How do we make sure that she has a right to wander, to be outside? She shouldn't be locked inside, but her mother is currently keeping her inside for very good reason, actually, because it's a very dangerous situation for her outside. So what we have to do is look at how do we make the whole situation a safer environment for her. And I think that's a really important consideration. And that involves sometimes some longer term strategies that maybe we need to be collaborating with, community volunteers and advocates that are doing social and behavioural change and looking at how we support those activities as well. Maybe I can take one more comment before we move on. we will be revisiting these case studies, but I just wanted to get us thinking about them early. Hello. Oh. Yes, hi. You're very, very quiet. I'm sorry. It sounds like we can't hear you very well.
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna write okay?
I think she's gonna write, yeah.
Yeah, so Jaya has written, it's important to acknowledge the violation and work with other stakeholders, including men and boys in the neighbourhood, to sensitise them and let them know that this behaviour is unacceptable. Also to find ways of supporting Sabine and her family and caregivers. Great. And creating space to share and express her needs. Yeah, so great comments and suggestions there. And all very appropriate. Let's move on to the next slide. I'm going to just run through some key considerations that, you know, Betsy and I have found that we use a lot in our work with GBV and child protection partners. The first thing to bear in mind is that violence against children with disabilities will be disclosed in all the same ways as other children. It might be disclosed directly, which is when they directly tell someone what has happened to them, as we saw in the case study of Sabine, but it can also be disclosed indirectly, where someone else witnesses the violence, or perhaps they have injuries or an STI, or sometimes present to services because they've become pregnant for adolescents. And it can be disclosed voluntary, as in the child, you know, shares information or requests information to be shared, but also involuntary, where in fact the child perhaps is sort of forced to disclose what's happened to them by other people in their lives. And so there's nothing unusual there. That's what we see with violence against, those are the different types of different ways that violence against all children might be disclosed. Some things to keep in mind, however, is that exclusion from child protection activities and lack of information means that children with disabilities may be less likely to understand or recognise the violence and abuse that's happening to them. They are systematically excluded from a lot of the age-appropriate information that's provided in relation to sexual and reproductive health, as well as gender-based violence. And so because of that, they can be oftentimes targeted by perpetrators because of that, because they're unlikely to recognise what's happening and disclose it. So we've got a lot of work to do there to make sure that we're involving children with disabilities so that they can recognise when something is not okay, when a certain behaviour particular, you know, is not acceptable, and know how to seek assistance safely. Children with disabilities, especially those with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities, may also not be believed when they disclose violence directly to people. It's not uncommon to hear that, you know, some service providers even say, well, they don't quite understand what's happened, they're misunderstanding, they're mixing it up with other things. And, you know, which obviously we all would recognise as being a bit of a flaw that needs to be addressed. And children with communication difficulties might actually face added barriers in actually expressing what's happened to them. We also know that family members and service providers might incorrectly associate changes in behaviour to a child's impairment. So say, for example, they perhaps don't communicate what's happened to them necessarily through speech or through verbal explanations. Maybe their behaviour changes. And when that happens, we often find that it's attributed to the disability rather than people exploring, hang on, has something happened to this child to result in their behaviour being different to what it was some time ago. And then confidentiality is often breached when a survivor has a disability. And that's because even the smallest amount of information shared between sometimes professionals that are, you know, doing their best to maintain confidentiality, unfortunately, there's it can be very identifying information, especially when we start to share sort of, you know, the type of disability they have, a little bit of information about the scenario, and then next thing we know, everyone is aware of what's happened. So those are just some key considerations to get us started. If we can move on to the next slide. What I've done here is I've gone through the principles of supporting child survivors and just given you some information about things you might want to consider as they relate to disability. Essentially, all the principles that we apply in supporting child survivors also applies to child survivors with disabilities. So when it comes to promoting the best interests of the child, some things you might want to consider is that there are, as I said before, increased risks for confidentiality, but also institutionalization that could be related to mandatory reporting. And as we discussed last week, in locations where children might be removed from the home and put into an institution for children with disabilities, in a lot of contexts we find that that is actually a site of increased risk of more violence. So we do have to, as you would with any child, think through carefully mandatory reporting processes and what's in the best interests of the child, especially if institutionalization and removing the child from the home is one of the strategies that might be put in place. We need to also support caregivers and address their needs, because sometimes we find they might want to follow a certain course of action, whether it be the legal assistance and the justice system in a context where perhaps that's not going to be in the best interests of the child. The second principle to be aware of is obviously ensuring safety, and some things you might want to think about early in your case management process to try to do this is, just if you've got a child that doesn't necessarily verbalize, inquiring with family members and caregivers about how does the child express if they are happy or unhappy, because that's really going to help us to know whether they're happy to continue with a discussion or an activity, or if in fact someone has come into the space which they're not comfortable with, who they don't trust. So being able to understand what makes someone happy or unhappy and how they express that is a really good first step in your case management process. We also can support the child survivor to identify a trusted adult in the case of children, but also it could be a support person for older adolescents. And that's not hugely different to what we would offer children without disabilities, right? We would follow that same approach, but let the child pick who they trust in terms of that adult and that support person. And then the last thing is always look at strategies to strengthen protective peer networks for the child and the caregivers, because as we saw already have started to discuss from the case studies, that's critical to ensuring their safety during this period. Next slide. When it comes to comforting the child, one of the tips I like to give people is that the importance of just acknowledging all communication that comes from the child and however they choose to express their emotions, and actually saying to them, I can see that you're upset, or I understand you're trying to tell me something. Maybe you don't even understand what they're trying to tell you, but acknowledging that they are communicating with you, that they are trying to contribute something to a conversation is really important. And that could look like yelling or rocking or other behaviors that perhaps you're not as familiar with, or perhaps you don't see as often with other children. So please do acknowledge these when they happen, and recognize that it's okay to say, I'm sorry, I don't understand, but acknowledging it and recognizing it can really help comfort the child. And avoid asking too many detailed questions about their disability. Sometimes we find that when a child with a disability presents with an incident of violence, that there's a tendency to want to understand everything about their disability. So what type of condition they have, what doctor they go to, when were they diagnosed, when did they get this condition? And in fact, that's not what they're presenting to your case management services necessarily for at that point in time. So just bear in mind that that can be a distressing line of questioning for not only the child, but also sometimes for the caregivers who, might be supporting the child to access services. In terms of ensuring confidentiality, it's really important to brief all the people that are supporting the child survivor, and that could in some cases include interpreters. Don't assume that interpreters, sign interpreters, for example, in different contexts, that they all understand you know, the principles of confidentiality, particularly the importance of it as it relates to gender-based violence or sexual assault. So please do brief them on confidentiality. And you can actually do some really interesting interactive activities with children, you know, with disabilities or without disabilities for that matter, to think through who they do and do not want to share information with, and the different ways they might respond to questions from others, like where were you this afternoon, when perhaps they were coming to visit your case management service. Next slide. And yeah, as we saw from the warm-up questions, pretty much everyone in the group agrees that we should be involving a child in decision-making, and that applies also to children with disabilities. And here I like to just put up front that my recommendation is that we would normally follow all the same guidance for consent and assent according to the age of the child. So, you know, most of you will be familiar with with these guidelines that already exist in relation to this. But you know, older adolescents, generally we say that they have the capacity to consent, whereas younger children, we might need to involve a trusted adult and but still look for their assent. Still look for them to be willing to participate in a line of action. You know, we don't want to force them to be involved in activities that they don't want to be a part of. And so with just some tips to remember with consent and assent is it's not a one-off event, and it's not a recipe that you can just implement with the same with every child. So consent and assent is actually a process, and understanding is going to vary according to the way we communicate to the child the information and the complexity of the decision, which could vary over time. And I like to always remind everyone that where the preferences of the child is a low risk course of action, it's okay to go with that, you know. So to give you a very practical example, you might have a child with a disability. I've got an example that I've pulled out from one of our tools, Maria, who has an intellectual disability. She might initially decline to go to a girls group. She might say, no, I don't want to go to a girls group. But perhaps she doesn't understand what the girls group is all about. And so maybe we have to communicate that to her in different ways. Maybe we need to discuss her goals and describe the activities to her, or even help support her to visit the activity and just watch, just see what the activity is all about, so that she can learn more about it and ask you any questions. That way she'll have a better understanding of the activity and also be able to tell you better what some of the positive and negative outcomes might be of participating. And it's also important that even if she declines at first, that we don't just leave it at that we revisit the potential of her being a part of this girls group at later stages, because maybe she learns more about it. Maybe over time she realizes that actually she does feel better when she talks to other people, and so she would rather join the girls group a little bit later down the track. The critical thing about this girls group is that the likelihood that if she attends and doesn't like it, she can stop attending. And the risks that she's going to face by doing that are not the same as, say, for example, choosing to enter into the legal system and to access justice, where she might have to recount her story many, many times and perhaps have people judging whether her story is accurate or real. That presents a whole different range of risks for Maria. So that's just an example of how you might like to think things through in terms of consent and assent. Moving on to the next slide. We want to treat every child fairly and equally, and what that means for children with disabilities is, again, coming back to this point of not making assumptions and actually providing all the available options to a survivor, to a child with disabilities, as you would for other children. Sometimes we tend to, you know, select what services we're going to offer them based on what we think they're going to be able to participate in. But we would encourage you to make available all options and then explore with them what some of the barriers might be that need to be addressed after they've decided what they want to participate in. And then lastly, strengthening a child's resilience is obviously critical. And here, some tips that you can do with children with disabilities. Look at what the child can do, not always at what they can't do. So all children have skills, capacities, and preferences which will be important in their recovery process. And the more time we spend getting to know what those skills and capacities are, the more we'll be able to use that in their case management programming. As I've mentioned several times, and we'll probably keep hearing about it through the course of today's webinar, support them to access age-appropriate information about sex and healthy relationships. So, you know, that's really critical for building their resilience. We have to start talking to them about sex and what is okay and not okay, what a healthy relationship looks like, and help them to build their protective peer network, because that's usually where young people like to access their information and reflect on their own development. And then lastly, and this is something Betsy's going to enter into now, we need to really foster positive power dynamics between children with disabilities and their caregivers, and really nurture that relationship where the caregiver is a non-perpetrating caregiver and a trusted caregiver. So Betsy, on that note, I think I'm handing over to you now.
Great, thanks. So hi everyone, I'm Betsy Sherwood. Great to be with you all again and meet some of you for the first time. So we're going to talk a bit about engaging caregivers. This came up in our last conversation. It is a critically important piece of work, particularly in the case management process. Like Emma mentioned, I'm just still reflecting on that 64% of folks who felt that they agreed that often caregivers are neglecting their child or adolescent with disabilities. And I think that's a really interesting point of reflection around how we enter into viewing caregivers. And I think in the work that Emma and I have had the privilege to do, we have run focus group discussions with hundreds of adolescents with disabilities, women and adults with disabilities, but also caregivers. And oftentimes our takeaway is that the caregivers, particularly those who are willing to consult with us and come into focus group discussions, they are desperately trying to be advocates for their children or their family members. So while neglect happens, and we have to be aware of that, more often than not, we do find that the relationship between the survivor and their trusted caregiver is probably one of the most critical relationships that we need to nurture in the case management process. Well, it can be really, you know, a complicated relationship to navigate sometimes. It's critically important to really take your time, develop trust, both with the survivor and with the caregiver, because that is the relationship that's most enduring, it's most central, and most likely it's the relationship that's going to help to support. It also means that we need to continue to work from a survivor-centered approach and continue to do all of the good kind of principles that we uphold in case management around focusing on the survivor. As we know, it's critically important to make sure that the survivor is informed and that they guide us through the process, and that they are given the decisions that they want to make in the case management process. So as we are working at this from the perspective of the caseworker, we have to use our own discretion, which we do in all of our work, around how do we make sure that we uphold the wishes of the survivor. We really think about the pieces of information that we are sharing, if it is helpful for the caregiver to know, if the survivor is comfortable with what we are sharing, and really think about how do we work through that in a thoughtful way as to make sure that we continue to work from a survivor-centered approach. So persons with disabilities should always be consulted around the involvement and engagement with caregivers. I see a really interesting comment in there that neglect is not always intentional. Absolutely, neglect is not always intentional. And I think that is something that we see when we talk about how do we support the caregiver. One of the most helpful ways to do that is to teach the caregiver certain skills around how to provide care, how to keep their person safe while also promoting the rights of their child. And some of the activities we can do to empower the caregiver and support the caregiver, which become critically important in the home and the life of the survivor that we're working with. We can move to the next slide. So the next main principle, you know, in any of our good child protection or GBV work, we often are talking about the role of power dynamics and how they play out. So power dynamics, particularly between the caregiver and the family member with a disability or their survivor, are critically important. So what we want to think through is the needs and perspectives of both the survivor and the caregiver, and the intersection and the relationship between each individual and the caseworker. So as the caseworker or the case manager, we are there to help to facilitate, to help to set goals, to help to break down barriers, and to really help the survivor realize what is important to them, mitigate their risks, and get them the healing support that they need. One way that we have done this is to develop a series of questions that you as the caseworker can reflect on. These are not questions that we pose directly to the caregiver or to the child, but this is a way for us to really think, step back, make observations, think critically about the power dynamics at play at the relationship that you're looking at, to really help you to guide and determine how to best engage the caregiver in the case management process. So we often want to think about what are the strengths of this relationship. Well, there may, sometimes the flaws or the things that don't settle well are what we reflect on first, but really dig down and think about where are their strengths within this relationship. Sometimes the caregiver might be working from a hyper-protective standpoint, which disempowers the survivor or maybe doesn't uphold their rights, but the strength is that they care, the strength is that they're committed to their family members. So think about, where is their strength within the relationship? And then think about, do both people have confidence in what the relationship is built on? Is there a mutual level of understanding, respect around how the relationship is built, or is there something that is disproportionate or unequal in the relationship? What are the mutual expectations and assumptions, and how do these interact? When we work in case management, we are working from a strengths-based and goal-setting perspective. Oftentimes, the goals or the expectation of the survivor with a disability may not align with that of the caregiver. We've given the example already of seeking legal services, but another example that often comes to mind is the caregiver may, for example, want the survivor to return to medical treatment or rehabilitation care, and the survivor has other pressing, more critical needs they're helping to achieve. I've worked with survivors who often say every time their caregiver brings up going back to rehab or physical therapy, they feel like they've let their caregiver down, that they haven't progressed, and it really impacts their self-esteem. So I think these are the types of things to really think about, to really navigate, and to really understand. And remember, our primary job is to support the survivor in their wishes and their goals. And then observe any tension. Every familiar relationship has tension. I think all of us probably have tension with a family member. It is natural, it is normal. Tension is, something that we observe. We have to figure out what are the points of tension. Are we as the caseworker contributing to the tension? Is there something that we are putting on the table that is creating additional stress within this relationship? And if that's the case, using our skills and our knowledge and our observation to step back and propose something different or take something off the table. Again, our primary job is to try and foster a healthy relationship between the caregiver and the survivor, not create too much of a dependence on us as the caseworker, and really think about how do we help to sustain and decrease stress in these relationships. So there's a lot there. And again, this goes back to our good instincts. It goes back to observing. It goes back to taking time in the case management process. I know this is something we talk a lot about as a sector. Case management is much more than filling forms and checking boxes. Me as a social worker and a caseworker, some of these particular cases I've worked on have been the most interesting and the biggest learning experiences, because you have to slow down the process. Depending on the type of disability, depending on the dynamics at play, a case may not move at the same pace that we're used to when we're working with a survivor with a disability, particularly who's an adolescent, and particularly if there is a complicated dynamic with the caregiver. Our expectations should be that this will be a case that takes a lot of time and a lot of reflection on our part compared to what we may be doing in our normal case management processes. So take that time, deeply reflect, come to your supervisor, talk these things through, maybe answer some of these questions and bounce it off of a trusted supervisor to make sure that we are being supportive, we're not blaming, we're not being judgmental, and we're not jumping to conclusions. So the next slide we're going to go to really talks about the caregiver as a person. I know that the focus of our content right now is child and adolescent survivors of GBV with disabilities, but it is critically important to highlight that caregivers who we know are predominantly women are also at very high risk of GBV. When we have run focus groups, we just continue to hear the emerging threats and the reality of risks for GBV. As we know, just from a social economic perspective, having a family member in the household with a disability puts you at an economic disadvantage for a variety of different reasons. We also know that female caregivers, particularly women caregivers, can experience their own set of stigma and discrimination in the community, depending on the culture and the context. We have heard mothers of children with disabilities say that their businesses have been disrupted. There's a fear, for example, to buy from them in the market because they're cursed, because they're unlucky. And so they start to oftentimes feel a stigma within the community themselves that can impact their overall self-esteem. So I think it's critically important to think about what are some of the things that this caregiver themselves might be experiencing. There's stress, there's resentment, there's potentially anger. I think we see that in the case study. This is a mother who we met who really, in the focus group, just wanted to continue to talk about what was happening to her daughter, and she was angry, and she was stressed, and she was concerned. So we have to continue to think about what are the threats to GBV, what are the additional risks, and caregiving can be exceptionally isolating. Oftentimes, your peer networks will break down significantly because you're spending so much more time in the household, providing care to the person in your family. So I think it's really important to think about how do we break down the barriers and create more space to reduce the isolation of caregiving. And also, it's also important for us to think about, are there ways for us to provide support to the caregiver outside of the support that we're providing to the survivor? And that might look like a separate case management process aimed at the caregiver if they are also experiencing significant GBV risks, or that might look like very conscientiously bringing that caregiver into other either preventative or group-based activities, including psychosocial support intervention, and really creating safe spaces for them to talk with other mothers, with other peers can be really important. I think this idea of where we can, teaching self-care. I know this is an emerging topic that we talk about all the time, but we do find that mothers with disabilities or other folks who are providing care, self-care becomes very hard to come by, and we need to be conscientious in reminding these folks we're working with the importance of self-care. We've also seen some really amazing community-driven ideas on how to better support caregivers. For example, in one of the locations we are working in a refugee camp setting in Ethiopia, the mothers with disabilities had established their own kind of informal peer group and developed a respite care between them. So essentially taking turns, they had 3 or 4 children amongst them, taking turns watching each other's children so they would have time to bathe, to shower, to go to market, to do important kind of activities on their own without leaving their child behind unsupervised or unattended. And that happened very organically. They met in an activity and kind of came up with these ideas and strategies. So one of the best things we can do from a programming perspective is make sure that these folks are intentionally invited, there's space for them to meet, there's space for them to network, and then we'll see some interesting, I think, community-driven ideas that come out of this. So we do have a tool. We love sharing our tools. This is a tool that we developed when I was at Women's Commission with Emma in collaboration with IRC. And it is just some principles and practices and great ideas for how to work with caregivers of survivors with disabilities. And it's a practical tool that I think you will hopefully find helpful. So that is available, and we can drop that in there again. We can move to the next slide. Great. So I think we were gonna, I know time is ticking as is always the case, break into 2 groups and talk a little bit more about these case studies that we talked about. So I'll be taking group 1 with Sabine, and Emma will be taking Amina in group 2. And I'm asking that we reflect on these 4 kind of critical questions. Number 1, can you identify key considerations for the caseworkers in supporting Sabine and Amina? Number 2, who else may the caseworker want to support or involve in case management? Who do they need additional support from? Number 3, are there any additional risks that Sabine and Amina face now that they're receiving case management, hypothetically assuming these cases moved into your case management process? And then what skills and capacities do Sabine and Amina have, and how could you as the caseworker use these in the case management process? I see already in the chat, many of you have moved into this activity and shared some really great ideas. I think I already saw some stuff around who else could we involve in case management, which is awesome. So what we will do is we will split into our 2 groups. We'll ask for support from Jennifer on that. And we only have about 15 minutes to talk this through. So please use the chat and speak up and don't be shy. We had good conversations last time, so hopefully the same this week. Jennifer, do you want to send us on our way?
Yep, here I go. Okay.
I like the countdown. The countdown works well.
Yeah, yeah, it helps. Yeah, and 2 minutes I always find is a little longer than people think. So. Okay. Looks like most people are back, so I'll give the floor over to you both. Great.
Great. Is everyone, are we back in session? If we are there. So there's never enough time for this, but I think we'll start with Emma providing a quick overview of her conversation in group 2, and then I'll provide, we had a really kind of rapid fire dialogue over here in Sabine's group. So Emma, do you want to give a quick snapshot of what you all discussed?
Yeah, I mean, we actually did get through all the questions in the end, which I was surprised about, but we found it easier to start with who might we want to involve in the case management process. So that was a good reflection that that's sometimes the easier point to start. I'm not going to go through the whole discussion, but as takeaway messages was number 1, really starting from Amina's perspectives of what her needs are and what she expresses as being important. We felt that that was something that maybe had been overlooked in her case earlier, and that's why she had never been referred or connected to the Women's Centre earlier. Also that we would, at the moment, the fact that her husband is actually seeking assistance for Amina, that this is a sign that perhaps there is you know, that he is you know, that he's someone that we can work with in this process, and that we need to be careful that the case management process doesn't actually deteriorate their relationship or exacerbate any power imbalances that already exist there because of Amina being married at such a young age. And then the last thing we talked about was her skills and capacities, and just recognizing that there is family nearby, women family members that we can connect her to, and that she is really interested in becoming a good mother. You know, she wants to be a good mother. She's worried about her daughter, and that those are all qualities that we can build off in our case management and make part of our case management process with her. Stop
Great.
there.
Impressed. We also had a really enriching similar conversation on our side. We got through almost all of them. So we were talking about Sabine, and she's in a camp-based setting. So it was interesting. We also pretty quickly brainstormed some folks who would be helpful in the case management process, talking about connecting her to sexual and reproductive health services, making sure that she was seen as a girl and a woman first and foremost, and getting her the information she needs on that. Also thinking about mental health and psychosocial services for her based on what she's experienced. And also there was a discussion around how do we engage men and boys so that they understand kind of what are the impacts, what is right and wrong in some of the behavior. And we had an interesting discussion as well around how we would deal with the perpetrator if the case was to move forward. One of the great points that came up from the very beginning was, you know, in this scenario, we had Sabine was sitting in the women's group and she was drawing in the corner, and somebody said the first thing they would want to know is, would she want to share what she's drawing and what she is drawing, and that would be a bit of a window into kind of where she is and what insight she might have. So again, a strength of hers is she draws, she likes to be around peers, she's an active person. And so we also thought about how could we coordinate with potential camp leadership, potentially those who are in disability, you know, rights organizations to help to promote accessibility, return to school, beef up her peer network again. And then we really thought about, you know, the group that the mother is in, and the work that we should be doing as group facilitators to make sure that we are protecting Sabine's confidentiality in the way that the mother is sharing, that there would not be the risk that she would have additional, you know, exclusion or discrimination if other folks in the community understood what had happened to her. So we were very concerned about briefing that group and trying to protect her confidentiality, also finding alternative activities for her during the group, fearing that she would be re-traumatized if she's hearing that experience shared over and over again. So that is a quick snapshot, but we had a lot going on in the conversation and in the chat. So I thank everybody for that. And we can move quickly to the next slide. If you have more to share, things I missed, then please drop them in the chat box, and that would be awesome. And again, you have these case studies, so you can use them, you can play with them, you can borrow on those questions. These are great activities you can run with your caseworkers and with your staff. So Emma and I really struggled on what to do with this final slide, and we want to acknowledge that we have not done something on supervision, which is something we really, really care about, but instead we opted to share this do's and don'ts table. I want to say we have additional resources on supervision and case management and ways that supervisors themselves can make space for this topic and can support their case managers. So we wish we had a little more time, another webinar, so that we don't get to that today. And instead, we like this table because we feel like it's something that you can use within your organization. You can very quickly share with the other caseworkers on your team, or particularly, you know, folks developing programs. So we understand what to do and what not to do. These do's and don'ts were developed out of what we heard from survivors and from people with disabilities when we consulted in focus groups. So really driven and led by them. I think the number one, I'll start with the don'ts because I'm a social worker, so I like to end on the strengths. So the number one is, again, don't investigate a rumor or seek out a child with a disability. Yes, we know that there is a disproportionately higher likelihood that a child with a disability may be experiencing violence, abuse, exploitation, sexual abuse, but we should not go out and seek them out looking to investigate. We should be seeking them out to bring them into preventative and community-based programs. We mentioned this before, but don't ask detailed questions about their disability or their medical condition. We want to work from a child-centered and trauma-informed approach. Asking questions about the disability may re-traumatize them. The way they acquired the disability may have been traumatic, but it also reinforces that what we see as a worker is only the disability. We don't see them as a person, as a girl, as a daughter, as a student, the other parts of their identity that may be more important. If we dig right in and pry about the disability, it often minimizes the other parts of their identity that they would prefer shined. Don't assume the child can't participate in decision-making or understand what you're saying. This takes time and this takes practice. This takes really being creative and thinking outside of the box, using different tools. We have a lot of tools around emojis, smiley faces, frowny faces, yeses, nos. There are a lot of different ways that we can take time to establish a way to communicate with a particular child. It does not happen overnight, but we can get creative to try and better understand how does a child communicate, what are the messages that they send, and what types of tools can we use to help that process. Don't only talk to the caregiver or support person. Oftentimes, instinctively, if a caregiver brings a child or an adolescent in, we go right to the caregiver and we start to ask them for their stories, their experience, what their needs are, versus if our programming is focusing on children and youth and adolescents, our very first point of contact after we have consent should be talking to the child or the adolescent themselves. Don't judge a caregiver that's seeking support for their child. Avoid asking why and having them feel blamed. As we talked about, caregivers already have a massive disproportionate level of stress in their lives. And so I think this idea of emphasizing the blame, asking why, it's not necessarily helpful or constructive to the conversation. So let's talk about what we should do. We should always ask the child, is there an adult that they trust, and how do you reach out or contact this person? The child, may have a primary caregiver, but they may have other trusted adults in their lives who we can engage in the case management process, who can be very helpful as we work through this. We can also ask trusted adults and support people for advice on how the child prefers to communicate. Again, this is not to let them speak on behalf of the child, but to really figure out, are there ways, are there cues, are there gestures that show what the child's communicating, and how can we learn them and use them? Acknowledge that the child, if they're trying to express something, it's okay to say that you don't understand, and that's okay, but at least they know that they are being heard. As we mentioned before, give children with disabilities the same age and gender opportunities. And also, I think a main thing is to learn to be uncomfortable. As a caseworker, some of this work is going to mean that we have to take time, we have to remove our bias, we have to be okay with saying, I don't understand, can we try this a different way? And we have to be okay with not always knowing exactly how to proceed, but being willing to be flexible to move forward. Okay, next slide. I know our time is ticking. So like we did last time, we'd love to set a goal activity. I had the really exciting, time to read through the chat from the last one and saw so many great goals where we looked at this from an organizational perspective. But what we'll want to do today is reflect a bit more from a case management perspective. For those of you who are still providing case management or supervised case managers, what is one concrete action that you can take over the next 4 weeks that would strengthen support for child and adolescent survivors with disabilities in your program? So think very concretely about who we're serving, children and adolescents, survivors with disabilities, and what is one thing that you can do in your programming over the next month. That could be a personal action, it could be something around professional development, or it could be something in terms of your programming. And if you're comfortable, just write that up really quickly and drop it in the chat box so that we can see some of the ideas of what you're committing to, and hopefully inspire others in your commitment to try and do something on this topic. So I'll give you all a minute to reflect, because I think we have maybe 30 seconds on this, and please use the chat and share any ideas you have. And then I will hand it back over to Jennifer and Sarah. Emma made a great point, which is other trusted adults could be older siblings or cousins. I think, thinking about the extended family is critically important. And I think that's something you also should take into consideration. Yep, so somebody's going to talk to their Leia's going to talk to her organization's protection team on incorporating this content into child-friendly spaces programming. Yes, I think that's hugely important. Raise awareness on disabilities with communities, educate parents and caregivers to pay attention to these children, learn how they communicate. Yes, that's, once you break that communication barrier in the case management process, it's really cool what can happen. Schedule workshops and training sessions in the field on how to respond to GBV, refresher, not just the protection teams. Do some mapping to measure inclusion, really important. Mapping is important, setting some goals around with your community mobilizers, really can they work to diversify the folks who are coming into groups? Can you give them a little bit of a goal to try and be more creative in their outreach and who they bring into activities? So share the do's and don't one pager. That's a great one, that's easy. And I know Jennifer will share these slides so you'll have them. Okay, I'll turn it back over to you, Jennifer and Sarah. I know our time is tight, but keep the ideas coming.
Great. Thanks so much, Betsy. And thanks so much, Emma. We have a thank you slide for you later on, but I realize we're running short on time. So I did want to open the floor in the last few minutes for questions, which Sarah Martin will moderate. And if you do need to leave, hopefully we can stay a couple of minutes over, but if you do need to leave, I also just ask that you fill out the feedback survey that I've popped into the chat. But over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, there was one question from earlier. Right now, everyone, if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat. But somebody did ask, why there are no statistics in the humanitarian sector on children and adolescents living with disabilities? Is this because inclusion is not mainstreamed into humanitarian programs? So curious to hear what the guest speakers have to say about that.
Hi, Sarah. This is Emma. So it's not that we don't have statistics about children, well, about people with disabilities in humanitarian contexts. We do have some statistics which look at prevalence, and we know that the number of people with disabilities. We know that in refugee contexts, for example, 20% of the population could have a disability. What we don't have, data on is like, how many children with disabilities are facing sexual violence, or, that is available through the GBV IMS in different countries, using appropriate, data sharing strategies. However, we all know that reporting to services does not necessarily equate to sort of incidents of violence. So yeah, that's where we lack the gap, and it's okay. We don't necessarily need to have those statistics, because we know that it's 3 to 4 times more likely that children with disabilities will experience all forms of violence, and then 3 times more likely to experience sexual violence than their non-disabled peers. That's already a lot. That already means we need to be doing a lot more to reach these children and to support these children if they're 3 times more likely to experience sexual violence than non-disabled peers in developed countries.
Yeah, and that raises a really good point about data. And on the GBV community of practice, we've been talking a lot about kind of the struggle around data and GBV, and educating people about why you don't need, tons of statistics to know it's a problem. So we're going to have another webinar on that soon.
Yeah, that's my argument.
There is another question as well. Are there any good life skills materials that have been adapted for the needs of children and adolescents with disabilities?
So I know of one organisation in Canada that has developed some interesting life skills materials for people with intellectual disabilities. I believe, though, it sort of targets an older age group. And that explores a lot of things like mapping body mapping, and say what's okay, safe touch and not safe touch, what's okay and not okay in terms of your space and who you let into your space, and how and those kinds of concepts. I would suggest that one of the things about working with children and young people is that we should be using lots of interactive tools anyway when we're doing life skills. When you do life skills work with children and adolescents, you're already using all these body maps, you're already using all these interactive exercises. And so that means that they are already quite accessible to children with different types of communication and different types of preferences and different ways of understanding things. So I would encourage you to just invite children with disabilities and sort of get them into your groups when you're doing life skills, and make sure that you're using as many participatory activities as you can, because that's what's going to help you to get information across to the vast, to the majority of the children that are in your group. I hope that helps.
Sorry, thanks very much, everyone. I think that's it for our time for questions. But if you do want to talk more about this on the community of practice, the GBV AOR community of practice, we'd be happy to continue to chat a bit more there. Back over to you, Jennifer, to close out.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Emma and Betsy, for answering those. We can stay on after we close if there are, or I can, if there are additional questions, because we did have some that came from the participants, but I'm going to move on quickly since I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So, and we're already 2 minutes over. So just one big thank you to Emma and Betsy. Their information is here. They really just took time out of their already very busy schedules and workloads to support us with these 2 webinars and really took the lead. So huge thank you to Emma and Betsy just for your time and support and really passion for this area. And I've learned a lot, and hopefully others have as well. Also, just a few announcements. As it's been mentioned a couple of times, there is a webinar series coming up in October, so please stay tuned for that. It's the IASC Disability Guidelines on GBV, and it'll be a series of webinars. So hopefully this will be a good, if you've attended this in the last webinar, this will be additional guidance for all of you. And then if you are a part of the CP-GBV Community of Practice, our next session will be Thursday, 22nd of October. And if you're interested in joining, please feel free to reach out to me. If you're interested in joining the GBV AOR Community of Practice, please feel free to reach out to Sarah at the email address you see. And I've shared the feedback survey in the chat, and I can share again as well, since I know the chat gets populated with tons of messages. Finally, I just wanted to invite Emma and Betsy to share some final words from some of the survivors that they've worked with. So yeah, so that we can really end by hearing their voices. So over to you.
Great, thanks Jennifer, thanks everyone. So these are some final words from a caregiver and her daughter that we met in Ethiopia. And she said, sometimes when I feel like I really need help, I talk to someone from the IRC team. They always listen to me, they invite me to discussions, they ask me to come and talk with other women. I enjoy this. I love my daughter very much. I want her to feel safe and to feel happy. I want to take good care of her. She loves to be outside and to see things and greet people. People in the community treat us better now. They are more used to her. They know how she is and they greet us kindly when we're walking. Hopefully someday everyone will treat us this way. And this is actually one of the women who started that kind of grassroots respite care with a few of her neighbors. And so I think she was really a great example. She proactively engaged in discussions, and the IRC team started little by little doing house visits, getting to know her, building trust, and then bringing them into activities. And it was a process and it took time, but the investment was worth it. And it was a nice story at the end.
Awesome.
Emma has the next one. Yep.
Cool.
Hi, so this is just a closing message from Bolia, who's a 16-year-old girl living in Burundi, in a refugee camp in Burundi. She said, sometimes we are just not included in activities or discussions, but there are things that are really important to us as a group. For example, we want to learn things, we want to go to school, we want to make friends, we want to be productive. Someday, some of us want to be wives and mothers, but people forget about girls with disabilities. They forget we have goals and dreams. I can learn, I can work, and I can do professional training. I can be more than just a wife to someone. I can be a better version of myself.
Thanks, Emma. That's really powerful words to end on. So thank you so much for sharing those, and thank you everyone for joining. We can formally close the webinar now, but I'm happy to stay on for another couple of minutes if anyone has any questions or anything you wanted to raise. So thank you again so much to Emma and Betsy and Sarah for all of your support in creating this webinar, and to all of you for participating. Hope everyone has a good rest of your morning, afternoon, and evening. Take care. And I'll stop the recording.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Yep.
Thank you.